From my mom's closet in Metro Detroit, Michigan, I'm Tim Descher, and this is Heritage Explains. On any given day, what's the news we typically see and hear about China?
U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to up the ante on a bruising trade war with China. He's reiterated a warning that he could impose further tariffs on Chinese goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars.
China raided our factories, offshored our jobs, gutted our industries, stole our intellectual property, and violated their commitments under the World Trade Organization. To make matters worse, they are considered a developing nation, getting all sorts of benefits that others, including the United States, are not entitled to.
So happening in just the past few minutes, China's national parliament has approved a controversial national security law for Hong Kong, which criminalizes acts of sedition and terrorism. Now, this coming as the National People's Congress meets in Beijing. The legislation has faced sharp criticism from governments all around the world.
We continue our look this morning at what China does not want you to see. The United States says the superpower is reclaiming land in the South China Sea. Artificial islands under construction could become military bases.
Okay, we've heard all those stories before. But here's one that may be new to you. Have you heard of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative? According to a Heritage report by Jeff Smith, here's what it is in a nutshell. In 2013, China made a big public announcement that they intend to spend or invest over $1 trillion on new infrastructure like roads, railways, bridges, and other connectivity investments across the Indo-Pacific and Eurasian supercontinent. But why? For China, it provides an incredible economic foothold in the region and also greater energy security, counterterrorism. It boosts Chinese exports and popularizes Chinese currency. So this is a big initiative happening right in the public eye. But what else is China doing behind the scenes? Let's look at Africa.
Some of these African governments are now beginning to realize that they are in a stranglehold. And they may have, as I said, understood some of the risks, but now they are looking around for ways to escape the stranglehold or to diversify away from the Chinese, because they have started to become more aware of some of these problems.
Our guest this week is Josh Meservey, a senior policy analyst for Africa and the Middle East here at the Heritage Foundation. In a recent hard-hitting report, he found that a similar 2-decade-long blitz of development in Africa proves that not only roads, bridges, and trains are being built by the Chinese, but he also uncovered 186 highly secure government buildings, as well as computers and networks have been built by the Chinese as well. On this episode, he talks about how intertwined China is on the African continent and how that is likely facilitating Chinese spying. He also explains China's goal in making these investments and what it means for American competitiveness, as well as our national security. Josh, it's been way too long since the last time we talked, so thank you so much for being back on Heritage Explains.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoy it.
All right, so first off, I want to gain a bit of context. From the intro of this episode, we know that China has been involved with building infrastructure in Africa for a long time. They now call it the Belt and Road Initiative. But this has been going on before that was started, and it's way more than roads and trains now. So give me just a little bit of context of where we're starting here. When did it start, and what's the goal for the Chinese?
Yeah, sure. So you're absolutely right. This is a long-running campaign by the Chinese government. This actually started back at the time of Mao, at the time of Chinese independence, where he was very interested in positioning China as the leader of the global communist movement, the global communist revolution, particularly among developing countries. So he began the Chinese focus on Africa, which has waxed and waned over the years, according to sort of the geopolitical context. But we're certainly in a waxing period right now, and so infrastructure, all sorts of diplomatic engagement, loans, things of that nature. But really, or was all a part of this. And then, as you say, the Chinese government announced this Belt and Road Initiative recently, and they began to lump a lot of infrastructure projects underneath that umbrella that were already existing. So it's a pretty broad range of projects that fall under this umbrella. Africa, again, is a major part of this One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative, and has been for ever since its inception, and even long before that.
Okay, so let me just go from there to here. So who approaches who? Is it a country in Africa goes to the Chinese saying, "Hey, we really need this building," or "Hey, we really need this road," and then the Chinese goes through it? Is it like a grant process, or does the Chinese approach the countries? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think it happens in both ways. And I say I think because part of the challenge of analyzing Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese engagement in Africa in general and around the world is that Beijing takes great pains to shroud it in as much secrecy as possible. So we are not even sure the terms of contracts that get signed. Mostly, sometimes, occasionally we'll get a glimpse for whatever reason, but usually we're not aware of the exact terms of lending contracts, of contracts governing these infrastructure projects. So it appears that absolutely many African countries do approach Beijing and say, "Hey, we'd like this road, or we'd like this building." But I also think it is clear that Beijing sometimes approaches African countries and makes an offer of, "Hey, let us build this for you or that for you." And some of this is predicated on what sort of financing model for these projects are extant or relevant, I should say. So that can run the range from commercial style contracts where it's a pretty high interest rate all the way to zero interest rate, or even to just grants that the Chinese government will lend. So I think particularly for the grants, that can be when Beijing makes an offer and says, "Hey, let us build this for you."
Okay. So we've got buildings and computers. Your report right now is talking about how China is building very, very high security level buildings in African nations. And we're not talking about, some just random building that's getting no use. We're talking about the highest of high. So there is definitely some things. They're also giving computers. They're also giving, networking. They're also doing all sorts of things like that that's going to help, as you say, increase China's intelligence in Africa. So my first question is do these countries know what they're getting into when they let this happen?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. And I speculate in the report, and it is speculation because it's hard to know for certain without an Afghan ruler telling you explicitly, which is very, very unlikely to happen. Let us say. So the report found 186 of these buildings that Chinese companies have built on the continent. And as you say, these are for the most part, these are very high level buildings. So, I found 24 presidents or prime ministers' residences or offices. There are parliaments that I found, military and police installations, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So again, very senior level buildings here. And I think that, by and large, again, speculating, Afghan leaders are aware of some of the downside risks that come with accepting this sort of Chinese gift and Chinese engagement more generally. I do think that many did not understand the full extent of the risks. It's watching Chinese engagement is fascinating. Again, I study it in the Afghan context. It's a bit like a boa constrictor, where it can be fairly subtle. The bands are tightening, and it suddenly becomes a stranglehold before you're actually aware that it has become a stranglehold. And I think that, as I say, some of these Afghan governments are now beginning to realize that they are in a stranglehold, and they may have, as I said, understood some of the risks. But now they are looking around for ways to escape the stranglehold, or to diversify away from the Chinese, because they have started to become more aware of some of these problems. I think some may have been aware and didn't care, to just put it very bluntly. The relationship with China is so important for many of these Afghan countries that they are not going to risk it for virtually anything. But including, expressing, they're not going to risk this relationship by expressing doubts or suspicions about some of these gifts that China is giving them. And then we should also bear in mind, as I make clear in the report, that some Afghan leaders benefit personally from engaging with China.
And you talk in the report quite a bit about China using this as a way of edging out American companies and American business from investing in Africa. How can you connect the dots there for me?
Yeah, sure. So one of the problems for the United States of China building all this influence on the continent is that they are establishing economic norms on the continent that disadvantage American companies, and not just American, others as well, but we're talking about the US here. And by that, I mean, they are, I already referenced corruption, right? So Chinese companies are happy to engage in this. They engage in it almost as a standard operating procedure. U.S. companies can't do that. We have nor should they. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which means you may well end up in jail or hit with a very heavy fine if you're an American company that gets caught offering a bribe to an Afghan leader, for instance. So corruption is a Chinese competitive advantage, and that really puts American companies in a hole when they are trying to compete for economic opportunities, of which there are many on the continent. So you have those norms that I referenced that are being established that disadvantage American companies. And then specific to this report, one of the problems of Chinese, of Beijing having access to these government buildings that they've built is that they can eavesdrop on American companies that are discussing in these buildings with their Afghan leadership about bids they might be making, business processes, all sorts of information they're passing to Afghan leaders that would give Chinese companies a real advantage if they knew. And so you're Beijing, saying, of course, has many state-owned companies. Yeah.
So just hypothetically there, I just because, again, I want to connect the dots here. Hypothetically, sure. You're saying that they could spy on a potential deal from a U.S. company. They could hear all the terms of the agreement and then come in and undercut us because they know, because they've been privy to that information, given that infrastructure that they built for China to spy on and listen to our conversations. I mean, that could be that's what you mean, basically.
Absolutely. Yes, okay. Precisely.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And you think about it, that'd be a huge advantage, right? If you're a Chinese company and you know what your competitors are going to, or at least some of them are going to bid, for instance, or you know to which minister they're talking, or, that's all really valuable information.
But you said that some of these leaders might not care about the strong foothold that China is gaining in the area because they're getting a clear, tangible benefit from it. How do we, and you talk about this in the report so we can work our way into it, how do we as Americans communicate that this is a bad thing for you, even though you're getting what you think is a good result and a good outcome, but this is really bad and you shouldn't do that? How do we approach that?
Yeah, it's tricky because no one likes to be lectured to, that's for sure. And there's a lot of understandable sensitivity on the continent, particularly about being lectured to by Western countries, and they, including former colonial powers. The U.S. is not a former colonial power in Africa, but we do get lumped in a bit with those countries. So you have to approach it delicately, of course. I don't think that presenting some sort of stark choice, it's us or it's China is the way to go. That's because honestly, a lot of them would say, well, okay, we're going with China. And that's, they are trying to walk a tightrope here between two great powers, one superpower and one aspiring superpower. And they don't want to get caught in the middle. So I understand that and have sympathy for that. And we also should be realistic about the fact that China does provide some of these African countries things that they want and need. They provide cheap technology, for instance. Now, there's a whole host of problems with that we can get into, right. But they do provide it, and that's great for African consumers. And they do provide a lot of this infrastructure, and Africa, does need a lot of infrastructure. So I think, we need to approach this as concerned friends. And we need to say, hey, you go ahead and engage with Beijing. We're not here to tell you not to. What we are here to do is try to help you get the best possible deal you can from Beijing and to protect you from some of these risks.
What can the U.S. do to sort of take back some of this? Is just doing business with the USA enough, or do we need to do anything more?
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture, as I laid out in the report. And actually, this report was very focused on the buildings themselves. And so it wasn't really even a comprehensive look at all of the vectors for Chinese surveillance on the continent. There are others. They've already unrolled their safe city technology in a number of cities on the continent. And again, we've already talked about Huawei and computers donating and all that, or donated computers and all that. So this is not even a comprehensive take on all of the risks, for Chinese surveillance on the continent. I actually introduce the report by saying that Beijing may have better surveillance access to Africa than anywhere else in the world for all of these reasons. So it's, and then I also. I try to be realistic here in the report because Beijing has built up such an advantage in this area that there's not much we can do there's nothing we can do, frankly, in the near term to completely uproot their ability to spy. That's a fantasy to think we can do that. That will require a much longer term, larger strategy that brings to bear all the elements of U.S. government power. And again, China will be in Africa for the foreseeable future. That's just for a whole host of reasons. Right. So I think, the U.S. needs to bring all the elements of national power to bear on this. And that doesn't mean we start ordering our companies around, because we can't do that, thank goodness, nor should we, obviously. But it does mean incentivizing them and trying to motivate them to be involved on the continent and doing what we can to facilitate that. It does mean telling our story in Africa. This is a great point of frustration for me. The U.S. has done a lot for that continent. We've had great relationships for decades, and it tends to get lost. There's a little bit of a "what have you done for me lately" mentality that we need to fight and just remind our African friends and others, the world in general, that the U.S. has been a staunch friend to Africa for decades now. Our record isn't perfect. That's not what I'm suggesting, but by and large, we've done a lot of good there. So and just unapologetically proclaim the virtues of democracy and of the free market system, because there is a battle of ideas going on most notably, the ones we're opposed to are led by Beijing. They are absolutely trying to convince African governments that their model is the best one for developing countries to adopt. And by their model, I mean this centralized, authoritarian, frankly, quite brutal system of political control, coupled with a little bit of economic freedom, but still sort of centrally managed economies.
Josh, government buildings in Africa are a likely vector for Chinese spying. That's the name of the report. It's going to be linked in the show notes. I hope you log on and check it out. I tried to get cheerful out of you, Josh, but
sorry,
I did the best that I could. But we really do appreciate you being here with us this week, and thank you for all the information.
Thanks, Tim. It was great. Appreciate your interest, and always enjoy talking.
And that's it for another episode of Heritage Explains. Thank you so much for listening. Go ahead and head on over to the show notes. I've linked to Josh's groundbreaking report and other relevant information, so get clicking and check it out. Now, have you shared our podcast with your friends yet? If not, please do. We promise, if you share, we will continue to produce excellent content. Go ahead, hit that share button wherever you listen, and thank you once again. Michelle is up next week. We'll see you then. Be well.
Heritage Explains is produced by Michelle Cordero and Tim Desher, with editing by Thalia Rampersad.